Chapter 20 Prairie Lotus. They had just started back to work when Papa's voice sounded from the shop. Right this way, Mrs. Harris, he was saying. Bess's mother? What's she doing here? Hannah's shoulders tightened. Her mind reached for a wisp of hope. Maybe she wasn't really ignoring me outside the grocery. Maybe she was just in a hurry to go home. But another part of her mind was already rebelling. Why do I always do that? Why do I bother to hope against what I know to be true? Was it because she wanted to believe the best of people? Wouldn't it be easier to expect the worst and not be left heartsick time and again? But what would that be like to spend every hour always thinking badly about everyone around her? She considered her choices. She could let Bess and Papa attend to Mrs. Harris. That was surely what Mrs. Harris would want, for Hannah to stay in the background, a hired girl, a servant. Or she could do her work as the future designer and dressmaker of Edmund's Dress Goods. Papa showed Bess's mother into the workroom. She was wearing a dress of brown calico trimmed modestly with a narrow red braid. It was nicely made. Hannah had noticed the same about Bess's clothes. Mrs. Harris was a good seamstress, and the red trim was an unexpected touch of style. Good morning, Mrs. Harris, Hannah said. Mrs. Harris nodded politely, but did not return the greeting. Bess looked up from her work with a broad smile. Hello, Ma, she said. Hello, dear, Mrs. Harris said. She turned to Papa. I hope it's all right for me to come calling before the shop is open. I thought it was my responsibility as a parent to see where Bess is working. Of course, Papa said. We're glad to have you here. If you'll excuse me. And he held up his paintbrush and nodded to Mrs. Harris and left the room. Hannah cleared her throat. Bess, would you like to show your mother around a little? I can make us some tea. Look, Ma, isn't this a nice room for sewing? Bess was saying as Hannah went into the kitchen. Hannah wasn't sure why she had offered to make tea, but as she filled the kettle, she remembered yet another axiom of Mama's. For the person who is sour, do something sweet. Even if she couldn't serve the generosity, even if she couldn't achieve the generosity of spirited practice by Mama, she could tell herself that she was making tea as a courtesy to Bess. These days, more and more people were drinking coffee, but Hannah remained steadfast by her loyal tea, both green and black. Green tea had been Mama's favorite, and as a little girl, Hannah had loved watching the tight, dried leaf buds unfurl in the hot water, like tiny fists opening. She loved it still. She liked black tea, too, brewed up strong and brown and gentled with sugar, sometimes with milk when there was milk to be had. In Los Angeles, Mama's Chinese friends drank only green tea, while Miss Lorna always made the other kind. Hannah had often wondered why everyone didn't drink both. It would be black tea for Mrs. Harris, of course. After a moment's hesitation, Hannah added to the tray a plate with a few of the cookies she baked for the opening. She carried the tray into the workroom and then invited Bess and her mother to join her. How nice! Bess exclaimed. She and her mother sat in the two available chairs, and Hannah poured for them, then went on to fetch a third chair. I'll not stand in the corner and wait on them as if I'm a servant. I'll sit down with them, and if she doesn't like it, she can get up and leave. The window on the north side of the building let in full daylight without blazing sun. The workroom was a bright and colorful place, made even more cheerful by Bess's chatter. Everything you need Everything you need is to hand, Beth said. You hardly have to walk more than a step or two. She took a bite of the molasses cookie. Mrs. Harris smiled at her daughter. She sipped at her tea and looked around the room. I must say, it is all very nice, she said. Bess, is one of your duties to clean in here? Bess looked taken aback. No, Ma, she said. I clear up the scraps and such, but I'm being paid to sew. Immediately, dread began growing in Hannah's heart, for she already knew what Mrs. Harris was about to say. I'm delighted to find the place so clean and pleasant, Mrs. Harris said. Thank you, said Hannah. Her hands were suddenly sweaty as thoughts raced through her head. I should say something. Quick, say it now. Don't think any longer. She opened her mouth and forced out the words. You sound as if you're surprised, ma'am. Well, it's just that you hear things, Mrs. Harris waved her hand vaguely. What kind of things? Hannah asked. Once she had gotten started, she found it easier to keep on. I'm going to make her say it. Ma? Bess said. She glanced first at her mother and then at Hannah, obviously anxious. Hannah felt a flicker of regret on Bess's account, but tamped it down. She was too angry now. I never said anything of the sort myself, Mrs. Harris said, but a lot of folks think that Chinamen simply don't have the same standards of cleanliness as we do. I'm pleased to see that's not the case here. There. She'd gone and said it out loud. Hannah had been called a dirty Chinaman more times than she could count. Usually the cruelty twisted her gut so hard she could not speak. But she finally tired of being angry at herself for that response, so she spent a lot of time thinking about what she would say instead. And now she would say it, with her face blank and her voice as neutral as she could make it. "Do you remember the golden spike?" she asked, looking directly at Mrs. Harris. Both Mrs. Harris and Bess appeared startled by the sudden change of subject. "Yes, of course," Mrs. Harris replied. "I was too young, but we learned about it in school," Bess said. "The rail lines from the east and the west met in 1869 in Utah Territory." "That's right," Hannah said. "The rail workers from the east were white, the ones from the west were Chinese." She took a sip of her tea, trying to calm the pounding of her pulse. Over the rim of her cup, she could see that the other two were utterly mystified. "The construction supervisor of the Central Pacific Railroad was a man named Mr. Strobridge," she continued. "He wrote a report stating that the Chinese camps were cleaner by far than the white man's camp, and that there was much less disease and sickness among the Chinese. And if you're thinking that this is a story the Chinese tell each other, I'll add to that my father was one of the railroad suppliers, and he had heard it right from Mr. Strobridge himself." She had been very young when Papa told her that story, perhaps 6 or 7, and she had never forgotten it. Her voice remained level, but she could feel that her face was hot. Bess was looking down her lap, and Mrs. Harris glanced somewhere beyond Hannah's head and shifted in her chair, clearly ill at ease. "I'm sure I didn't mean to cause offense," she said. "I think I had best be leaving. You needn't see me out." And she left the room before Hannah could say another word. Hannah's cheeks were still burning. She knew she might have lost a customer. Mrs. Harris might well find her impudence cause enough to stay away. Papa would doubtless have a few words to say about that. But at the moment, Hannah was more concerned about Bess. Losing a customer was not nearly as important as losing a friend. Bess was on her feet, having stood and watched her mother's abrupt departure. Hannah looked at her, not sure how to begin. Should she apologize? If she did, it would be insincere. She wasn't sorry for what she said. In fact, she was proud of herself for having mustered the courage to say it. A moment later, when Bess turned around, Hannah was surprised to see that her face was almost expressionless. "Shall I go on with the skirt tears?" Bess asked. Hannah blinked. That wasn't what she had expected. Maybe she doesn't want to talk about it now, or ever. "Yes, that will be fine, unless you'd rather work on something else." Bess shook her head. She sat down, bent over her needle, and began to work. Hannah took up her own needle again. Was it better to pretend nothing had happened and just get on with the work? An awful lot of people dealt with difficulties that way. Hannah was as loath as anyone to talk about disagreeable subjects, but she hated the thought of them lurking, waiting for the moment when they could rear up again. Chapter 21. The awkwardness dissipated when the girls discovered that in addition to their shared dislike of sewing buttonholes, they also hated putting in whalebone stays. Together they giggled their way to a solution. When it came time to put in the stays, they would take turns doing them, so neither one of them would have to do all of them. And the same with the buttonholes. "A blood vow," Hannah replied. "Which of your fingers has the most pinpricks?" They held up their fingers and pressed them together. At the end of the day, Hannah was more than satisfied with their progress. It now seemed entirely possible that with both of them working on it, the dress could be finished in 2 more days. As Bess rolled up her apron, she said, "I almost forgot. Would you walk with me to the church site? My pa's working there this week, and he asked me to tell you that he'd like a word with you." "Of course," Hannah said. She wondered why Mr. Harris wanted to speak to her, and asked Bess if she knew. "No, I don't," Bess said, "but he didn't seem upset at all, if that's what you're thinking." Hannah didn't exactly know what she was thinking, so she was puzzled by the request. The church was being built on 2nd Street, 2 blocks beyond the schoolhouse. Walking Bess past the school in the hot sunshine, Hannah was surprised by how small the schoolhouse looked. She had been a student there only a week earlier, but it felt like years ago. When they reached the building site, Mr. Harris was up a ladder nailing rafters. He spotted the girls and waved hello. Charlie Hart was there too, framing a window. "Hello, graduates," he called out. Hannah and Bess smiled at him and at each other. They stood waiting in the narrow strips of the shade formed by the wall studding. A few moments later, Mr. Harris climbed down the ladder and took off his apron. After a long drink of water, he wiped his hands and his face. "All right," he said. I think I'm about as presentable now, and if I'm not, you'll just have to pretend and pardon. Bess, would you fetch that jug and my apron to the wagon? I need a minute with your friend here." "Yes, Pa," Bess replied, as Hannah's heart did a 1-step jig of happiness. "Your friend," he had said. Mr. Harris walked with Hannah several paces away from the skeleton church. Don't worry, Hannah, you're not in any kind of trouble, he began. She was relieved. She couldn't think of anything that she had done wrong, but there was something about being around the law that made a person feel guilty. I just need to ask you a few questions about what happened on Monday. Monday? Mr. Harris continued. Your father told me that you had seen some Indians outside their land. This was about the Witchapeewin. How could she have forgotten? Papa told, even after I begged him not to. Papa, how could you? I could lie. I could say I never saw him. He's the law. I have to tell the truth. But what if the laws are unfair? Didn't the colonists disobey King George's laws because they were unfair? Hannah almost missed what Mrs. Harris said next. What you saw, and we'll go from there. She swallowed hard. I'd rather not say. She saw in his blue eyes wide in surprise. Well, now, can't say as I expected that. He didn't sound angry, just puzzled, which gave her the courage to speak. Mr. Harris, I wouldn't lie to you, but I do I have to tell you what I saw? Yes, you do, he said. There's no courthouse here, but I'm the law, and everyone has to answer to the law. If you don't tell me, that's called contempt, and it's within my right to arrest anyone for contempt. Hannah almost choked on her next breath. It hadn't occurred to her that she could be arrested if she didn't tell him. I'm the law here, Mr. Harris repeated slowly. There's times when the law isn't a cut and dry thing and it has to be interpreted. In those cases, you have to trust the man serving the law. Papa had said that Mr. Harris was a fair man. He had allowed Hannah to attend school, ruling in her favor against all those parents, but she did not know how he felt about Indians. No, that's not entirely true. The fact was, he was a white homesteader on the frontier and was in itself a statement against the Indians. But I'm no different. Papa and me were right here in LaForge, same as Mr. Harris. This was Indian land until a few years ago. No, it still is Indian land, stolen by white people. You steal something, that doesn't make it yours. And if Witchapeewin hadn't had a pass, Hannah didn't see where there'd be any room for interpretation. She could tell him what she had seen and risk the arrest of Witchapeewin and the others, or she could refuse to answer and risk being arrested herself. Her heart weighed down by the misery of her cowardice. She whimpered back inside her head. I'm sorry, Witchapeewin. Sorry, sorry, sorry. It was just a group of Indian women, she said, her voice trembling. Just women? Women and children, two little girls and a babe in the arms. What were they doing? Digging for turnips. Somehow Hannah had to get Mrs. Harris to understand that, but she would have been careful not to give him too many details about Witchapeewin, which may put her in danger of arrest. Did you know that the Sioux word for prairie turnip is timpsina? Hannah lifted her chin in steady voice. They taught me that, and they gave me some and told me how to cook it. So I made soup and I put some timpsina, and Bess, she ate it and she liked it. She stopped, aware that she was about to babble. Soup, huh? Mr. Harris hesitated before asking the next question. I don't suppose you saw any weapons? Not weapons, wooden sticks for digging up turnips. He looked thoughtful then and was silent for several moments. Hannah stayed quiet too, sensing he was now making up his mind. That pass system, he said, as far as I know, it's intended to keep Indians from congregating for the purposes of war or raiding. In my judgment, a group of women and girls harvesting prairie turnip does not constitute a threat to LaForge. I don't see any reason to send a report to Yankton. Thank you, sir. Hannah exhaled, only aware then that she had been holding her breath. That is the end of chapter 21.